The Story Smuggler, a very brief memoir by the International Booker Prize winner Georgi Gospodinov, who won the Booker for Time Shelter, which I also reviewed on this channel in October last year. This book is a very brief memoir, which was published in 2024, but this is a re-edition because the first edition was in 2016. This was published by Weidenfeld and Nicholson, translated from the Bulgarian by Kristina, Kovacheva and Dan Gunn. It's a very thin book, but very substantial in content. So it has, it's written in very short chapters, some of them almost like vignettes. The first one is, I would say, it's a sort of almost an origin story. It answers the question how the writer became a writer and what is a writer. And so let's see. My earliest apprehension of literature came when I was little in a totally ordinary, even run down neighborhood eatery. Here, every morning, my father would order tripe soup for us and lemonade. By the way, tripe soup was also very common in communist Romania, where I grew up. We used to eat it usually after partying on whole night and drinking alcohol, and then in the morning we would go to an eatery and eat tripe soup. So, so this is a scene with the little Georgi and his father, and as he was eating tripe soup, he notices hanging on the wall a blue plexiglass signboard on which I read for the first time, and I quote, "Writers are surgeons of the human soul. Their job is to cut from the soul all that is rotten and decayed." So, well, anybody who grew up in a communist country recognizes kind of the lingo of Puritan communism, because communism was a very Puritan ideology. So according to communist ideology, the writer was like a surgeon who cut with a scalpel into the human soul and took away everything that was rotten and decayed. And what is interesting here that immediately the little Georgi has a hostile reaction. I don't know whose ideological brainchild it was to hang the slogan in an eatery where no living writer had ever been spotted sipping soup. Writers inhabited other worlds and other restaurants, while here the only customers were workers on early shift. So he goes on to say that, "Never have I forgotten that plexiglass sign in our local eatery, and if I'm asked to list influences of my work after Borges, the Bible, and my grandmother, I like to point to it." So in effect, according to this origin story, he became a writer, or his idea of writing is precisely the opposite of that idea of what a writer was supposed to be, according to communist doctrine. I quote, "Long ago, then, I killed off the literary surgeon within. Ever since childhood, I have been aware, thanks to my grandmother and the stories she would tell me until I fell asleep, I was afraid to fall asleep, that stories, which is to say literature, serve principally to provide solace. And what is more, that the fluffy, ill-defined creature called the soul ought to be imagined as a pet rabbit with soft ears and warm paws, a creature calling not for a knife, but rather for comfort and caress." Okay, so we can see here that, so first of all, he defines literature as something that is in relation to the soul, that explores the soul, and the soul is something that needs solace and is soft, opposite to the rough thing that needs a scalpel. Okay, so the second little chapter, or the second chapter, or little vignette, answers the question, why I write. So he tells us about the nightmare he used to have when he was 6 years old. And I'm not going to go into the details of the nightmare, although it's a rather Freudian nightmare that would be interesting to be analyzed in itself. But let's gloss over that. So what is interesting in this story is that so he was 6 years old. He had this recurrent nightmare, and eventually he wrote it down. And here, when he explains how he wrote it down, he says that he used to write it down on a chemical pencil. And that reminded me that in Romania too we had chemical pencils, because, by the way, In communism, it was very hard to find pens and pencils. They were rather rare. But we had what we called chemical pencils, which were the same. So Bulgarian chemical pencils have to be licked, and then they write in bright glossy letters, while the tongue becomes blue like a gold. Yeah, that was the same in Romania. So so he writes, so the child writes the dream down, and then that has a consequence that he never forgets it, but also he acquires insomnia. Now, conclusion. Was I saved by this transcription? Yes and no, he says, because he never forgot it, but he also acquired insomnia. And something else, I realize now that the motive behind the writings of that 6-year-old boy are the same as mine today. I write because I am afraid. Okay, third story. This one too resonated very much with me. Oh, I have to say that it was very interesting for me reading this book, written by a Bulgarian writer, because as a writer who's grown up in communist Romania myself, there are many parts of this book that I could have written myself. It was incredible to me to see how much similar our childhoods were, also because we are almost the same age. And obviously, I knew that Bulgaria had the same regime, but I didn't think that actually our cultural references were that similar, and even our imaginaries. So, for example, in chapter number 3, he talks about the fact that in communism, he used to dream of cakes because he couldn't have them in real life, because his mother often could not afford them. So he says, I dreamt of how I'd buy them, how they would be served on a small gold-rimmed china plate, how I would sit down and spare the moist cake with my fork. I'd often wake just as I was raising the first forkful to my mouth. So this made me remember that actually I too used to have dreams as a child and as a teenager in Romania of eating sweets or chocolate. And well, of course, now I know that Freud interprets this. I mean, in Freudian analysis, any kind of dreaming about sweets or chocolate, it means that that's a sexual dream. It's a substitute for, sweets or chocolate are a substitute for sex, which is very likely true, if you're not hungry. But I think if Freud had lived in a communist country, he could not have come up with his theories, because in communism, a cake was a cake. If you dreamt a cake, that meant that you were hungry. So, okay, chapter number 4. Oh, in chapter number 4, he talks about the clubs that we had in communism, which were also very common in Romania. We called them circles. So at the time, everyone was a member of at least 3 children's clubs, and personally, I was signed up to 6. Communism did not favor free time, not believing that an individual could cope with it alone. Pleasure and perversion lurked within it. My time was well distributed between the Young Nature Lovers Club, the Accordion Club, the Biology Club, the Mathematics Club, the Athletics Club, and the Children's Arts Club. So he goes to the Children's Arts Club, which is led by the local poet. I was not as lucky as he was. I couldn't get in any of these clubs, so I think I just had to enroll in some ridiculous club that I hated. So anyhow, he goes to the Poets Club. And one day there came from Sofia an important children's poet. There was even a photo of him in our school books, though in reality he turned out to be a grumpy old man with a large pot belly. How could you write about children and have a large pot belly? Well, okay, so the famous poet asked the children to, recite their own poems, and there comes Georgi's turn, and he tells a poem about death. And well, if you in communism, you're not supposed to write about death, because why would you write about death, especially if you're a child? If you lived in a country that was so great and everybody was supposed to be happy, why would you be unhappy and write about death? So the famous poet starts to berate the poor child, and then the teacher feels obligated to intervene. So the teacher says to Georgi, well, why don't you show the poet, the famous poet, why don't you show him another poem of yours, which is about sunsets? So that was really bad too, because the famous poet gets even more upset because sunset was patently a Western phenomenon, and nothing good could ever come from the West. From where does the sun rise, children? Our own school teachers would often ask us. From the east, we would respond, leaving them to add, from the land of the great Soviet Union. So, yeah, writing about sunsets and about death was not good in communism. Okay, chapter number 5. This too reminded me of my youth in Romania. It's amazing. Again, it's amazing how similar our childhood and youth were. Each of us children owned an illicit secret notebook that we passed to others to write in. Who knows why, given they had no particular connection to dictionaries, but such notebooks were called lexicons. They were a slightly larger format of notebook that we would wrap in colorful paper. An act in itself amounted to heresy, since all our school books had to be identically wrapped in white with identical name tags. Anyhow, so in these notebooks that were passed from, high schooler to from student to student in high school, the students would write questions or would answer questions asked by the students, or sometimes they would cut and paste images that they took from Western, in particular German, fashion catalogs, which were extremely popular in communism in Romania too, and I see that in Bulgaria too. They also cost a lot of money because they just made you dream, because they had all these things in them, these German catalogs that had things that you couldn't find in communism. So you just bought them and you just looked at the images, and then you cut off the images and you put them in these so-called secret notebooks. I don't remember what ours were called. He names also some of the things that we talked about in them. Oh, he also says that we, for example, we would ask ourselves what rock group you listen to, and the most famous rock group in Bulgaria, just like in Romania, was AC/DC. I remember that all the high schools walls were scribbled with AC/DC, AC/DC. So apparently it was the same in Bulgaria. So some of the questions that students used to write in these notebooks were: do you listen to rock music? Which is your favorite group, favorite movies, favorite actors and actresses? What do you think about love? Do you have a boy or a girlfriend? Have you ever been kissed? So these were the kind of questions were really kind of touchingly naive. But he interprets them as a private niche or a private world that students used to have in communism, because in the official and in the public life, nobody would talk about this. In the public life, you would be asked questions like, what do you want to become? I mean, what do you want to do as a pioneer? So this kinds of uplifting, sort of socially grounded questions, but never questions about love or your personal life. By the way, I don't know if I already mentioned that communists were really, really Puritan, and talking about eroticism, for example, was taboo. And I quote from him: the lack of erotica coexisted with the lack of oranges, new apartments, sanitary towels, cooking oil, paprika, and televisions. As my grandmother would say when occasionally I would try to convince her that God did not exist. Oh, in Bulgaria, nothing exists, not even cooking oil or paprika. Trust my grandmother to roll a physical and a metaphysical lack into one. God, cooking oil, paprika. End quote. Okay, chapter number 6. In Bulgaria, we have the word, and I'm sorry, I can't pronounce this, Shutsbina, something like that, which corresponds more or less to abroad. But for us, this abroad really did signify a single separate country. Only there could you find chocolates, the land of a forearm. Only there did men wear beards and hair to their shoulders. Only there could you lay your hands on chewing gum in the shape of cigarettes. Only there could you attend a concert given by the Beatles. So again, this is similar in Romania. We use the word afară, which meant literally outside, to refer to everything that was outside of the country, because we viewed the country as a prison. So outside was all the other countries, but mostly the Western world. So that was similar too. Okay, chapter number 7, about another word. And this also is a really similar, taga, if I pronounce it correctly. And he describes this as a word specific to Bulgarian, which is untranslatable. He says, It is not quite sadness, not exactly sorrow, nor is it melancholy. The word cannot be translated into English without translation of the entire Slavic concept behind it. In Taga, there is longing, something unrealized, the dream of what has been lost forever or of what has never been achieved. There is a very similar word in Romanian, which is dor, which means very much all these things. And the funny thing is that Romanians believe that this Romanian word is very specific to the Romanian soul, that it's untranslatable, and that nobody else has it. But apparently the Bulgarians have it too. And they too think that it's something specific to Bulgarians. But I guess it obviously is it's obviously a Slavic concept and a Slavic state of mind. I'm sure the Russians must have it too. Okay, let's see. Chapter number 8 it's about belly buttons and a Bulgarian custom that consists in that small part of the umbilical cord that's tied in a knot on the baby's belly and which during the first weeks after birth gradually dries out and turns into an insignificant little scab before it falls off. Everywhere they probably just discard it, but in Bulgaria it gets to be preserved. According to superstition, it serves as a token of the baby's future. So apparently people keep it in some kind of a little recipient, and then supposedly where this belly button is going to be placed, there the baby will end up living. So because Bulgarians, just like Romanians, want to live abroad, a lot of Bulgarians are trying to export their belly buttons into Western countries, and so a lot of people travel with their belly buttons and they deposit them in various Western countries. Now, I come from Transylvania. In Transylvania, we do not have this custom, but I do believe that they do have it in probably in southern Romania, because I remember having read in Mircea Cărtărescu's, the Romanian writer Mircea Cărtărescu, in his novel Solenoid, he mentions his belly button having been kept by his mother, at least the narrator. So since he comes from southern Romania, which is closer to Bulgaria, I have a feeling that the custom does exist in southern Romania, but not in Transylvania. Okay, and the last chapter I'm going to mention, chapter number 12. This is a chapter about travel and childhood. My personal discovery and disappointment have been that childhood does not inhabit the sights of our childhood. I dine in an Indian restaurant in London, and the taste of the freshly baked naan bread returns me this time to the family hearth. What's common to Indian cuisine and my grandmother's peasant loaves? They speak a common language, of course, that of the former Eastern colonies, one belonging to the British, the other to the Ottomans. While empires ruled, the colonies cooked. Okay, so here we have something that Anglo-Saxon readers are not really used to, because when Anglo-Saxon writers and readers talk about colonies, they tend to think that there is the Western world on the one hand, and then there's, I don't know, other countries, mainly non-Western countries that are the colonies. So you have the Western colonizer and the others colonized. But the fact is that this binary world vision doesn't exist in Eastern Europe, and that's because we have a very different history, because we are at this crossroads between different worlds, between East and West, North and South, and because we Eastern Europeans were colonized by the Turks. We Europeans were colonized by Muslims. And by the way, my grandparents on my paternal side come from southern Romania, which was, historians don't call it a colony, but in effect, that part of the country, just like the rest of the Balkans, were colonized by the Turks, because you can even see it in the customs of the people there. So when you come from this part of the world is not divided like for Westerners into this, this binary way. You can see the world more like a puzzle, and you can find similarities between very apparently dissimilar places like, Bulgaria and India. And this is the talent, Gospodinov's talent, but also the specificity of coming from the Balkans, because then you look at the world in a very different way, and you know that you as a Bulgarian have something in common, for example, with an Indian, and because both of you were Eastern colonies, even though a Bulgarian is a European. So I invite you, Anglo-Saxon people, British and American, to get this book, read it, and reflect on it. The Story Smuggler by the Bulgarian writer Georgi Gospodinov.